Are you looking for the complete guide to .NET Core MVC? If so, then you are at the right course. My name is Brugan and welcome to .NET Mastery. If you are new to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button. That way you will never miss an update from .NET Mastery. Now this is not one of those courses where we typically have a small application and we perform CRUD operation. And with that you might be wondering, what exactly will you learn from this .NET Core MVC course? We will start from ground zero when it comes to MVC or .NET Core. We will understand the fundamentals of .NET Core and all the basic files and folder structure that comes when you create a .NET Core project. Main target for the course will be MVC, but I will also give you a basic introduction to Razor Pages and how it is different from an MVC application. Once we understand the fundamentals, we will start building a simple CRUD application using MVC and Entity Framework Core, and while we build that, we will see client-side and server-side validation. We will be using SQL Server to store our data, and to access that, we will use Entity Framework Core with repository pattern. While we build our project, we will learn some advanced concepts like ViewBag, view data, temp data, data tables in .NET Core, how to integrate Toaster and Sweet Alert notification, along with intentionally introduce bugs while programming, and much then more. I show you how to debug. My main goal is not to show you the happy path of programming, because of which that will give you a real-world exposure to the common error messages and how do you debug and fix them. As you can see, this will be a lengthy course with almost 10 hours of content. There is a lot to learn and explore, and I have covered all the basics of .NET Core MVC. If you enjoy the video, make sure to like the video and leave a comment. But before moving forward, let me show you the final application that we will build. Let me show you on what we will be building in this course. We will be building a fancy application where we will display all the books for sale. On the home page, you can see all the products. We have a login and register button here. When a user clicks on register, they can populate all the information here, and we have multiple roles in our website. Right now, because we are learning on registration, we are allowing them to select the role, but in production, this will be hidden. Once you register, you can log in, and we will have two types of account. First will be a customer role, where when they log in, they will see all the products. They can navigate to the product details, and there will be an add to cart, where we will display coming soon. That is all that a user can see if it is a customer user. If we log out here, and if we log in as an admin on the other hand, we will be able to perform all the CRUD operation, and you can see based on the role, a special content management just appears in the drop-down. There a user can see all the product categories, they can create a new category, we have validations there, and they can delete a category if they want. Next, we have CRUD operations on product, and this time we have a fancy data table where user can search for something, they can sort and do all kinds of fancy stuff. They will be able to create a new product from here where we have a fancy rich text editor, and basically we will have to provide different price. We have to select category that we want for a product, and user will also have to select an image that will be uploaded. If we go back and try to edit any of the product, we can see the existing product and we can replace that if we want. On top of that, when we try to delete, we have nice notifications that you can see right here. Also, when we create a new category, let me try to create a temp category here. We have toaster notifications. That looks much better. As you can see, admin can manage all the content, and if you click on the email address here, you will notice we have a manage profile where admin can manage their profile, update their password, and do other things. So you can see there is quite a few things that is going on in the website that we will be building. But the main focus here is to understand the basic foundations of .NET Core, MVC, with a small CRUD application, and then take that application further by implementing authentication, authorization, and much more. Let me walk you guys through the journey of .NET Core in this video. .NET Core is probably the biggest change .NET programming language has encountered. In 2002, Microsoft introduced web forms, and that was a revolution at that time. But web forms had its own drawbacks, and there was a need to overcome all of them. Because of that, the .NET team came up with a new architecture, which was .NET MVC. Now, even though I love MVC and I have built many applications using MVC, it had its own flaws. Like it was created on top of the components of web forms. Because of that, it was tightly tied to IIS and ultimately Windows operating system. But with evolution of development, Microsoft had to keep up with the changing technology. As a result of that, in June of 2016, Microsoft released ASP.NET Core, and it was the first version of .NET that was built on top of this new .NET Core framework. This .NET Core platform has been completely rewritten, and it is a cross-platform version. Because of that, it is not tied to Windows operating system. Now, since .NET Core was rewritten, it was written with cloud architecture in mind, and because of that, it is extremely robust. Then in August of 2018, Microsoft released the next version of .NET Core, which is .NET Core 2.0, and after that the team has been very active in releasing new versions of .NET Core. Lately they have finalized that in November each year they will release the new version with new features. So in November 2022, .NET Core 7 was released, and .NET Core 8 will be released in November of 2023. Now, even though the final version of .NET 8 will be released in 2023, we can use the preview version of .NET 8 using Visual Studio Preview. So the preview version is out there, and that is what we will be using in this course. That is a small overview of the .NET framework and its evolution. Now that being said, why should you even learn .NET Core, and what are the advantages that .NET Core brings to the table when you compare the classic .NET language? The list is quite extensive. First one is that .NET Core is fast and open source. If you compare that with traditional .NET applications, there have been quite a few benchmarks, and .NET Core is very fast when you compare that to web forms or even .NET MVC. Then .NET Core is cross-platform. The classic .NET was tied to IIS and Windows, but since .NET Core is rewritten, it has removed that dependency with .NET Core. And with .NET Core, we have a built-in dependency injection. Dependency injection is super great when you will move along with the course, and by the time you finish the course, if you work with .NET Core, you cannot imagine yourself going back to the code where there is no dependency injection. It saves a lot of time, and it is extremely efficient in managing all the dependencies. With any programming language, it is critical that new updates or new versions that are released, they should be easily upgradable. And that is one of the great features with .NET Core. The updates have typically been very smooth. and because of that you can always keep up with the new version. .NET Core is also cloud friendly. As we move along with the development, more and more companies are leaning heavily towards cloud development, and .NET Core has been built with cloud architecture in mind. So that is why it is very flexible when we have to integrate .NET Core with the cloud technologies. Lastly, when it comes to performance, .NET Core exceeds all the previous version, and even the new versions that are released in .NET Core, they supersede the previous version. Microsoft has invested a lot in .NET Core. That gives us a clear idea that Microsoft has a long-term plan with this technology. So with that brief overview, let me continue from the next video. When you will be working with the course, you will require some project resources. I have added all of the project resources in one place, which is .NETmastery.com. So there, if you navigate to courses, go to the course detail here, we have few things right here. First, I have a live preview of the final project that you will be building if you want to navigate. Next, I have GitHub code. Well, let me go back and open that in a new tab here. And there, if you notice, I have all of the commit based on the lecture name. So we have section and then the lecture name. If you go there, you can exactly see in that lecture what was modified. So if something does not work for you, you can go here and look at that exact commit to make sure that you do not have anything else. That is a great resource. Then we have course content. Make sure to download that and let me open that file. Once you open that, you will see two folders inside there. If you are taking the old course in .NET 6, there are all the resources based on the old course. But if you are taking the .NET 8 course, there are all the project resources where we have all the images that are being used. We have code snippets for lecture, and I have the final PowerPoint which you can use in your project. So make sure to download all the project resource before you move forward in the next video. Before we move forward, let me walk you through on what are my expectations before you take the course. This course has very few prerequisites. As you know, we will be learning ASP.NET Core MVC in this course. Because of that, you must have a basic understanding of the C# programming language. If you have worked with the traditional .NET applications, that is completely okay. As long as you understand the basic foundations of C#, you should be good with the course. On top of that, we will be using SQL Server for our database. So you should have some experience in writing queries for SQL Server. I do not want any fancy experience like functions and anything complex, but basic SQL like select statement, delete statements, and those basic SQL syntax, you should be familiar with them. As long as you have these two basic foundations, you will not face any issue in the course. I will be starting from ground zero when it comes to explaining .NET Core, MVC, and how everything comes together. With that, let me continue from the next video. Now, when we are programming, we will require some tools. These are the three tools that you will need for this course. First, you will have to install .NET 7 or .NET 8. When you are taking this course, if .NET 8 or latest version of .NET, if that is in preview, then make sure to download the preview version and follow along. You will require Visual Studio 2022 if you are using .NET 7 because .NET 8 is in preview right now. But if you download .NET 8, then you can download Visual Studio 2022 preview, and with that, we will be able to use .NET 8. Finally, for the database, we will require SQL Server and SQL Server Management Studio. So basically, you can follow along with this course using .NET 7 or .NET 8. I will also have links to everything in the description of the video. So make sure to download them and let me continue from the next video. What we have to do is create a project using Visual Studio 2022. I have opened Visual Studio 2022 here and I will select Create a New Project. On the left hand side here, I will have recent project templates, but what we want to do here is search for MVC, and with that we should get ASP.NET Core Web App. Now the project we want to work on is MVC application, so make sure to select the one with model, view and controller. There is also a web app without MVC that uses Razor Pages. We do not want that. We will give our project a name of Bulky Web, location wherever you want to save it, and then we need a solution name. Now solution name I will keep that as Bulky because in there we will have multiple projects. With that configured, let me hit the next button. The framework that we want to use is .NET 8. We will select that. Authentication type, we will be adding authentication later on, but right now we want to keep things super simple and then we will add on to our project. So right now we will keep that as none. Configure for HTTPS, that looks good, and we will not check the do not use top level statements. It is just adding the using statements at the top and it is not that important. That is why we can just ignore that and hit the create button. With the click of that button, the magic happens and your project is created. I will explore all the files and folders that are being created by default, but before that, let me add this to source control. I have already signed in to my Git repo, so that is coming along. Repository name, let me call that bulky_MVC. I will make that a private repository for now, but once the course is launched, I will convert that to be a public repository. With that configured, let me hit create and push button. And perfect, we have two outgoing changes. Let me push them. Perfect, so we have created our project and we have committed our code to the Git repo. Our project is created here. Let me walk you through all the files that we see right here one by one. But before I even do anything with that, let me run the application by clicking the HTTPS here, and that will build the project and open that in the browser. Perfect. By default, we have a simple application. Let me zoom in here, and we have two things in the header here, homepage where we see welcome here, and we have a privacy page where it displays a different page. So one thing you can see right out of the box, we have a header here, we have a footer, we have a body here, and we have navigation that is already configured by the default .NET project. That is great news. But before we take a look at any other files, the main file that I want to show you is the project file itself. To examine the project file, you have to right-click on the project. Now here there are two things. One is a project which is Bulky Web, and then one is a solution which is Bulky. A solution can have multiple projects in .NET. Right now we only have one project which is Bulky Web. When we examine the project file, it belongs to a project, so we will right-click on Bulky Web, which is our project, and there we have something called as Edit Project File. Perfect. When I open that, you can see it is pretty simple right now. In the older versions of .NET Core, this was more complicated, but they are simplifying this with the newer version. Inside Property Group, we have something called as Target Framework, which says that we are using .NET 8.0, which is the .NET 8 framework. Then we have something called as nullable, and that is enabled. Now what exactly this nullable will do, I will cover that in the later videos because it is too early to go into those details. And next we have implicit using statements. If you are coming from any front-end library or any other frameworks, you should be familiar with some import statements that you write to import other libraries. Now because implicit using is enabled here, the default using or import statements from the .NET libraries, we will not have to write all of that. It will automatically be included with our project. If you disable that, then basically you will have to explicitly add import statements, nothing more complicated. But it is a convenience to have implicit using enabled, and that is the setting we will keep as well. Project file basically has all the project properties which are set by .NET right here, and on top of that, when you add some of the NuGet packages or npm packages, then you have to add them in the project file. Now when we add NuGet package, I will show you how the project file here gets updated in the upcoming videos. But right now, when we have the project file, we have the .NET Target framework that is really important, and we have Nullable, which has been introduced from .NET 6. I will explain that in later videos as well, and we have implicit using. Nothing that fancy right now, but when we add more things to our project, I will show you how the project file gets updated. With that brief overview, let me continue from the next video. After the project file, we have something called as connected services, but that is empty. We will ignore that. Next, we have the dependencies. When we build a .NET application, we always or most likely will be having more packages that will be added for more functionalities. Like if we have to access database, if we want some payment integration, we will be adding more packages. Right now in our dependencies, we do not have any package. Now when we have multiple projects, we might also add project as a dependency. So when we do that, this dependencies will automatically reflect that. And we will do that in future videos, so do not worry. Dependencies basically mean that this project is dependent on some packages or some other project. But we do not have any dependencies on NuGet package or any other project right now. Then we have a properties folder, and there we have launchsettings.json. Now this launchsettings.json basically defines a file which will say that when we are running or debugging the application right here, when we click on HTTPS, what should be some settings that should be used. You can see here there is IIS settings, and there it is saying that you should use the URL, which is HTTP one with the port number, but if it is an HTTPS, this will be the port number. Then if we scroll down, we have something called as profiles. These profiles resemble everything that you see here. You can see we have an HTTP profile, HTTPS profile, and IIS Express. In profile, we are saying that when we use HTTP profile, we want to run the application on this URL, and we are setting some environment variables. Environment variables will basically be like a global variable that is defined, and we can use that in application. As an example, let's say if you are setting ASP.NET Core environment to development, then inside the code you can check this variable. If that is development, you might use a different development database. If it is production, you might be using a production database. Same applies for, let's say, if you have a payment integration. If it is development, you want to use your development keys. That way you do not have to use a real credit card. But if it is production, then you want to use the production key. That way real credit card payments can be processed. So we can define all of those environment variables and profiles in launchsettings.json. If you scroll down, we have an HTTPS profile, and that is what we are using right here. You can toggle between the profiles by selecting which profile you want to run the application with. We are using HTTPS here, and here we have the application URL. Let me hide that, and that is 7169. I can update that to be 7001, and let me run this. Perfect. When we execute that, you can see the application is now running on port 7001. That way you can toggle some of the properties. We also have IIS Express here, and you can modify them as per your requirement. Now typically you do not modify the profiles that much, but I wanted to give you a quick 5 minutes overview on launch settings.json. Perfect. Whoops. Let me stop the application here. Next file that I want to show you is in the controllers. Well, in the launch settings, let me revert back the change. So here I can undo my git change, and that will bring back the original port. Now of course you can use whatever you want, but I'm not going to change that. With that, we have covered launch settings and the project file. Next folder that we have is www root folder, and this is an important folder in the application. This folder will basically host all of the static content of your .NET Core or your project. Now what is static content? Static content basically means any CSS, any JavaScript, any NuGet packages or third-party libraries, or if you have any images, files, PDFs, PowerPoint, and so on. Anything that is static which does not have an HTML code goes into the www root folder. So you can see right here we have a global site.css which is already being used in the application. So if you want to add some styling here, you can always add that. Next we have the JS file, which is site.js, but that is empty. We just have a basic template there. Inside the lib folder, we can see Bootstrap, jQuery, jQuery validations. All of them are included by default when you create an MVC application. In future, when we have to add images or anything else which is static, we will always add them in one place, which is www root folder. Always remember that. After that, we have controllers, models, and views that I will cover in the upcoming videos. But after that, we have something called as appsettings.json. And then if you expand that, you can see we have appsettings.development.json. App settings will be the place where you will host all of your connection string. Now when I mean connection string, it is not just connection string, but basically any secret key that you have for your application. An example of that will be for your email, you might be using SendGrid, or you might have a secret key for email. You will add that in app settings. When you have database connection, you will add those secret keys there. If you are using Azure Blob Storage or Azure Storage account, you will be storing all of those connections in one place. That way, when you have to change a connection, you always know that you have to go to appsettings.json and not go through all the code trying to find out where is that connection. All of your connection or secret keys should always go inside appsettings.json. Now here you see there is appsettings.json and appsettings.development.json. If you remember, inside launchsettings.json, we have the ASP.NET Core environment. Now based on this environment, it will be configuring to use a different connection string. Like let's say in production, you will have an environment variable with the name of production. Then inside appsettings.json, well, in the project here, let me add and show you that new file. We will be adding a new item, and we will search for JSON file. We have the app settings file. I will call that appsettings.production.json. We save that here, and what will happen with .NET Core is it will dynamically use that connection. Whoops, I have a spelling mistake there. Fix that. So perfect. Now in production, if your ASP.NET Core environment name, this is production, then it will be using the connection string and all the settings from this app settings.production.json. So it is pretty smart on what connection it will use. But we will uncover that in the upcoming videos. Right now, we do not want to go into that complexity. Only thing you should remember is all of your secrets or connection string will go in app settings.json file. Let me remove the production file that I added right now. We are not going to use that, but in the final section where we will be deploying the code, I will modify that and show you how things work. So perfect. With that, in the next video, let's examine program.cs, which is a critical file. Now I want to cover a main file, which is program.cs. In the older versions of .NET Core, we used to have two files. We had program.cs and we had startup.cs. But with the newer version, the .NET team has combined both of those files in one file, which is the program.cs file. Now here, let me zoom out, and when we have to configure a .NET application, there are two things that you should remember. First, we have to add some services to our container, and next we have to configure the request pipeline. In the program.cs, those are the two things that are being handled. First, you can see there is builder.webApplication that creates a builder. On that builder, we are adding some services. Right now, we are using MVC for our architecture, and that is why on builder.services, it has added something called as add controllers with views. That way it knows that okay, our application will be using controllers and those are already defined in the .NET project, so I know how to handle that service. In future, we will be adding many more services inside program.cs file. Like if we have to inject something using dependency injection, which is a very critical aspect in .NET Core, we will inject all of them inside the services right here. And the next thing that we have is we have to configure the request pipeline. Pipeline basically means that when a request comes to an application, how do you want to process that? Now one thing that you see on line 9 here is we have app.environment.isDevelopment. This is the same environment variable that we saw in launch settings.json. IsDevelopment is a built-in helper, and you can see we also have isProduction, isStaging. But if you have some custom environment name, you can use isEnvironment and pass it there as well. That's too technical for now, but I just wanted to give you some overview on how the environment variables are being used. Here we are saying that if the environment is not development, then we want to use an exception handler and we want to redirect to home error page. But if it is development, then we want to see that exception. That is why we have this if condition. After that, in our pipeline, we have added HTTPS redirect and app.use static files. When we add the use static files, it will configure the www root path and all the static files in there will be accessible in our application. After that, we are adding routing to the request pipeline and we have authorization. Now ignore this authorization right now. We will cover that when we have authentication and authorization in our project. But by default in the request pipeline, just have that authorization is added. If you even forget that, that's okay. Next, we have something that is important. Now, when we have an application, we are telling it how the routing should work. And for that, we have app.mapControllerRoute. It basically has a default pattern that if nothing is defined in the route, you should go to something called as a home controller. Inside there, you should go to index action, and ID here can be defined or not. A question mark in .NET basically means that ID can be defined or it can be null. So we are defining the default route that it should follow. And finally, we have app.run that will basically run the project. Now it might be confusing on what is going on here. Why do I need program.cs file? What is all this middleware, pipeline? Very strange words. Do not worry. When we progress with the course, everything will start making much sense. The reason I spent 5 minutes on this file right now is you have a rough idea that there is one file where if I have to add a service to the container or I have to configure the middleware, I have to go to program.cs file. That is all that I want you to digest from this 5 minutes and have a rough idea of what I talked about. If nothing here makes sense, that's okay. You should only remember that when you have to configure something in the pipeline, program.cs is the place you have to go. With that understanding, let me continue from the next video. If I go to Solution Explorer and open the program.cs file, you can see in the routing we have something called as controller and action. Remember these keywords for now. If you open the Solution Explorer again, you will notice we have a folder with the name of controllers, we have models, and we have views. That basically defines the MVC keyword. MVC stands for models, views, and controllers. But how do all three of them come together? Let me show you a brief overview about that. In the MVC architecture, as I said, first letter stands for model. Model represents the shape of the data. So if you have any tables or if you have any classes, model will have all of that. And what I mean by class is, let's say you are building an e-commerce application where you have products, you will have orders, you will have order details, shopping cart, and much more. Models will basically have all of those class files. Next, we have something called as view, which stands for the user interface. So whatever you see on the screen, that is the view part of the MVC application. So model represents the data, and what you see on the screen is the user interface, like if you have a form or if you have a fancy chart that you see on the browser, all of that is represented by the view. View will control the HTML element of your web project. Now you have the view where you have the fancy HTML that you see on the screen. But when you have the data, you will have to process or even fetch that data, because data might be inside database. So you need something to fetch that data and display that in a table on your HTML view that you have. That missing piece or heart of the MVC application is the controller, which is the last piece of the missing block here. Controller will basically handle the user request, and it will act as an interface between model and view. What happens is when a user clicks on one of the button or opens the website, the request will first go to the controller. Controller will then determine what model it has to fetch. It will retrieve all the data that is needed using the models, and then it will pass all the data that is required to be displayed to the view component. What view will do is it will add all the data in its HTML formatting and pass that data back to the controller, and then controller will send that response back, and the data or website will be displayed on your screen. So one thing that you should always remember is, in an MVC architecture, controller is heart of your application. And it might sound like I'm repeating this over and over again, but MVC architecture can be tricky to understand if you are getting started. So let's walk through that again. When a user opens a website, it goes to a controller. Controller will then fetch data from the models or wherever it has to do, process that data, like there might be some conversion or anything that it has to do. And once the data is in good shape, it will pass that data to the view. On that static HTML, it will add the data that controller has passed. Like in view, we might have defined that there is a table, but what data that table needs, we will pass that from controller to the view. Then view will add that data in the HTML, and final content, it will return back to the controller, which will ultimately be passed on to the user screen, and user can see the complete website. This, my friends, is the basic architecture of an MVC application. Now, a controller can have many action methods. Action method basically define the endpoints in a controller, and we will uncover that in the next video. But there is something called as action methods there as well. If I go back to the website here, you can see where we have the default route. We are saying that if nothing is defined, you should go to the home controller, and there you have index action and something called as ID. Let's ignore that. Right now, you know the basic MVC architecture, and let's cover this routing in the next video. Now we want to understand routing in an MVC application. Routing basically defines that in the URL, when you type something, where it should send that request to. We have configured a default route here, but when it comes to an MVC application, we have a certain pattern. And before I show you that in the application, let me walk you through a presentation here to give you a rough idea. You can see the URL pattern for routing is considered after the domain name. Localhost and port number is the domain name. This localhost can be google.com, can be .netmastery.com, or whatever you want. When we have to consider routing, we remove that piece, and anything after that is considered the routing pattern. In an MVC application, the typical route that we have is a controller and then action. Those are the two words that you should always remember and write it down. There is a controller, and inside controller, there are action methods. Let me show you that with an example here. In this first URL you see, we have the domain name, which is localhost, and then we have something called as /category /index, and then a number 3. So the first thing that you see after the domain is the controller name, and next thing with a / will be an action name. After that, if there is anything there, that will be the ID. ID is an optional field that we already saw right here. You can see that is question mark. So if we go back, what is the first thing after the domain name? That is the category. After that we have index, and then if there is anything present, that will be populated in the ID. That is the default pattern that has been defined in the .NET project. Now of course we can modify some things here, and we will do that in the later videos, but this is the default pattern. We have controllers, and inside there we have action. Based on that, I have an example here, and I want you to find out that based on the URL, what will be the category and what will be the action, and if there is an ID or not. The first example here, category is the controller and index is the action. We do not have any ID, so ID will be null. After that, we only have something called as category. If there is no action defined, then by default the action will be index action. We do not have any action defined in the second example, so controller will be category, action will be index, and ID will be null. In the third example here, we have controller name as category, action name as edit, and then we have some ID with the value of 3. And the final example here, we have a controller with the name of product, We have an action with the name of details and ID with a value of 3. Now you might be wondering, what is the importance of this assignment? Well, it is really important. From now onwards, if you look at a URL that is using MVC architecture, you can tell what is the controller name and what is the action name. Now if I go back here, we are saying that the default controller is home and action is index. That basically means that if nothing is defined after the domain name, it is telling the application that you should go to home controller and index action method. That is the default route that .NET team has configured in program.cs. If you want, you can change that default route, but that is the default route, and you know how that will be converted to a URL if you want. Now enough talking. Let me show you routing in action in the next video. Now you have a rough idea of what is a controller and what is an action based on the URL. So basically, if you have a URL, from that you can tell me what is the controller, what is the action, and what is ID. With that rough idea, let me go back to the project here and I will open Solution Explorer. You can see there are 3 folders here that we have not covered yet. There is a view folder, there is a model folder, and there is a controller folder. In controller, you can see we have something called as home controller. When we are naming any controller, one thing that is important is the controller keyword. So if you have a home controller, you should have the name followed by the controller keyword, and that must be placed inside the controllers folder. If you place it somewhere else, it will not work. These are the rules that are defined for the MVC architecture. So in controllers, we have home controller. In models, we just have one model, which is error view model. It is a basic class file and it has 2 properties, nothing fancy, and we don't want to go into those details right now. Another thing that I want to point out is when a request comes to controller, it is not always required that a model is needed. Sometimes it can render a view which can be a static view and no model is needed in that case. But I want you to keep that in mind, that model is not always needed. Perfect. So now we have a home controller here and all the views related to that controller will be placed inside the views folder with the exact same name as controller. And this will be home and not home controller. Controller is a keyword here, so actual name of the controller is home, and that will be the name of folder inside views folder. That is the architecture for MVC. We have controllers and all the views that corresponds to that controller must be placed inside the views folder with a subfolder of the exact name as the controller name. So perfect. We can see in home controller we have an index view and we have a privacy view. If I run the application here, and right there you can see we have a home page and a privacy page. Right now we only have one controller in our application, so both of the view belongs to the same controller. When we load the page, you can see the URL. We do not have any controller name or action name. We just have this welcome text. Let's see where that text is. Inside home view, we have the index view. If I open that, that is the exact text that we see right here. We have the welcome, we have learn about, and we have an anchor tag with building web apps with ASP.NET Core. So what we see on the home page here basically is displayed from this index view inside the home folder. When we click on privacy here, we have the privacy policy. And if I open the privacy.cshtml file, that is the data that is being displayed right here. Ignore this view data for now, but you can see the paragraph tag is exactly what we have. Now something interesting that you should notice here is when we are going to the privacy page, the URL here is something that we have seen before with routing. Based on this URL, can you tell me what is the controller name and what is the action name? The controller name is home controller and action name is privacy. Now how does that come together? I will show you that, but before that, let me change this to be index. So home controller, index action, press enter, and perfect. We get back to the home page. How did that happen? When we click on home page, it does not define anything in the route, and that is because the default route that we have here, we are saying that if nothing is defined, go to home controller and index action. So that means that even if you define home controller and index action, it will take you to basically the same page. So I hope you can see how things are coming together. But the main question, how does it know where it has to load this particular view that we see? Let me show that. We have home controller and index action. For that, let me go to the home controller here, and we have few things right here. You can see there is something here, but ignore that. What I want to show you is in home controller, what we have down here, these are called the action method. On line 11, we basically have a constructor for our class, and I will explain you that in later videos. But other than that, we have 3 action methods here, and they are returning something called as iActionResult. I was telling you before that there are 2 things, controller and action. What we have defined in the URL, we are telling go to the home controller and get the index action. So at that point, it will go to the home controller and it will execute this index action. In index action, we do not have any code. We are only saying return view. What does this mean? Well, it basically says that we have to return some view inside the views folder. But what view does it have to return? And that is where the naming that we have given to folder comes into picture. If we have not defined a name inside this round bracket, it will use the same name as the action name. So it will return an index view. But where will it get that view from? It will get that view from the home controller, so it will go to the home folder inside views, and there it will get the index.cs HTML. And if we type home/privacy, it will execute the privacy action method, and the view that it will return will be the privacy view because that is the name of the action method. Now ignore the error action method that we have here, but you can see how index and privacy are executed. Now with Visual Studio, we have great debugging functionality. For that, what you have to do is right here, when you hover, you can see a circle dot. If you click there, that means you have added a debugger. Let me add that in both the lines here, and if I go back here, and if I execute home, index and press enter, you can see the breakpoint is being hit here. That means that this statement is being executed right now. So that proves that it is going to the index action method. We will have to hit continue here, and then it will navigate or continue execution and bring back the website. When we click on privacy, it will go to the privacy action method, and we continue here, and perfect. So with that, I hope you have a rough idea of how routing works. But let me show you something before I end the video. When we are returning back to the view, actually, let me go to program here, and rather than home controller index action, let me set the default to home and privacy, and let me run that. Now when the application loads, we do not have any URL defined, so on the home page, it will invoke the privacy action method and that view will be returned. Perfect. Let me roll back that change and I will go back here to controller. There, when I am returning the view, as I said before, if nothing is defined here, it will look for the same view with the name of the action method in the folder of that controller name. Now rather than that, I am saying that when the index is being called, I want you to return a view with the name of privacy. In that case, it will go to the home folder and look for a view with the name of privacy, and views have an extension of .cs HTML. Let me run this. Now the default page, it again loads the privacy page, but to prove you that, if I go to home and index, privacy view is being loaded. So you can always override what view will be returned, but this is the default that we have if nothing is present. I will also roll back that change to keep things simple for now. But I hope with that you have a rough idea of how routing works. And again, in controller, we will have action methods that will define what view needs to be returned back. Now MVC is tricky to understand, as I have said before, so I do not expect you to understand 100% of the things that I'm explaining right now. But even if you are understanding 50 to 70% so far, that is a great progress. And when you actually start implementing this in the upcoming section, everything will start making much more sense and you will understand why this pattern is so powerful. With that overview, let me continue from the next video. Now that we have seen routing, we know how the views are being displayed based on the URL. But if I run the application again, that is not the only thing that is being displayed on the page. Because if I open the index.cshtml, you can see there is a welcome text and a learn about that we see right here. But what about this header that we have on the top, and we also have a footer? How is that getting loaded? And for that, we have to go to solution. In views folder, we have seen what is there in the home view, but we have something called as shared, and we have something called as underscore view imports and underscore view start. If you have worked with older .NET application, you might remember something called as a master page and a child page. Underscore layout is the master page of your complete application. If I open underscore layout here, you can see we have doc type HTML, we have a head here with some styling, we have a body, and there we have the header. In header, you can see we have the home and privacy links here, and we scroll down, we have something called as render body. This render body is a built-in helper in the MVC, and that will display anything that we want in the body. Now what that body will be, that will be determined by what is returned from the controller. If we return the index view, it will display that view right here. After the render body, we have a footer here where we are displaying the bulky web. If we go back to the application, that is what we have right here. So underscore layout will be the master page of your application or the main page of your application. Always remember that. And in underscore layout, we will add all the JavaScript, all the CSS that we want to use globally in the application. With that, we have something in the anchor tags like ASP controller, ASP action. These are called tag helpers, but ignore them. When the time is right, I will explain you why we need them. Right now, underscore layout is the master page of your application, and whatever view we return from the controller, that will be displayed in the render body content of underscore layout. After After that, let's go back and we have something called as validation scripts partial. There we have basically included two JavaScript. Now when we progress with the course, we want to add client-side validation, and for that we will be using this JavaScript. Because of that, on all pages, validations are not needed. So what the .NET team has done is it has added some of the basic JavaScript here, and then on the pages where validations are needed, it has separated that out in a different file, and we can use them in our file only if needed. We will see that in action down the road, but here we have something called as validation script partial. Now one thing that you notice here is in validation scripts partial we have an underscore. This underscore is not required in layout or validation scripts partial. But typically if that is a page or component that is used throughout the application, then we typically like to add an underscore. That way when we look at the name, we can know that okay, this view will be used throughout the application. And there is also a special name for that, which is partial view. Partial view basically means that they cannot be displayed on the page by itself. They will be incorporated as a part of some main view. But that is a little too technical or little too early for now. But just keep that terminology in mind that there is something called as view and there are partial views. By the name, partial views are basically the views that you do not use by themselves. They will be consumed inside the main view. Then next we have a view for error.cshtml. This is the view where we display the error message if anything is encountered, and we can ignore that for now. Now one main question that I had when I was learning MVC was how does the application know that this underscore layout is the master page of the application? That is simple. We define that inside the file which is viewstart.cshtml. There we are telling that the layout of the application is underscore layout. If I change this to be layout here, let me stop that and run it, things will not work. We have an exception here, the layout cannot be located. And you can see where it is actually looking for the layout. To fix that, what we can do is I can rename this to be layout, and then it will start working again. Perfect. So you can see that is how the application is configured to know what is the default layout or master page of your application. Let me revert back the change here. I will keep it underscore layout. That is the name you should be familiar with and not layout. Perfect. Let me run the application and it should work the same. Great. So view start will define what is the master page or what is layout of your web application. Then we also have something called as view imports. Here we have defined bulky web and bulky web.models. We have added using statements here. If you are working with .NET, you know the using statements are used rather than typing that every time. If not, do not worry, when the time comes I will show you why using statements are needed. But on top of that, it has added something called as tag helpers. That also we will cover in upcoming videos, but view import, you can think about that as a global import file. Rather than importing or writing the using statement in all file, you can add that here and that will automatically be available in all the views. Now again, the view import or the using statements that we have added here will only be available in the views and not in controllers or models. When the time is right in the future videos, I will show you the importance of view imports, and we will also be adding more imports in the file. Let me close all the tabs here, and with that I believe we have covered all the files in the views. We have a model, controller, and perfect. Now with the overview that we have covered with all the files and folder, it is the perfect time to get our hands dirty from the next video. Now there is one teeny tiny thing that I want to tell you right now. When we go to controller, we have a controller and we have an action method there. It is returning something called as a view. If you are coming here from traditional .NET or some other programming language, you will be smacking your head. What is this view? What is this action result? Why is this return type? Typically, we have a return type of, let's say, an object or maybe a string or something like a list or IEnumerable. IActionResult is one of the custom classes or rather interface that is implemented in the .NET framework, and that basically implements all of the possible result type for an action method. So even if things are looking like it's magic right now, it is not, and when you progress with the course, you will see how everything comes together. So right now, do not, and I'm saying that, do not try to smack your head or be too hard on yourself on trying to understand every small piece that you see on the screen. By the end of this course, I will cover all of them to make sure that no stone is left unturned. But when I say that just assume this is the syntax right now, just assume that for now, because I know when I will be moving forward with the course, you will understand all the basic foundation. Nothing is magic, everything is programming, and you will learn all of that by the end of this course. So right now, don't be too hard on yourself, and let me continue from the next video. When we are working with any website, typically we have a database, and inside there we have multiple tables, and based on that table, we perform some operation and display some data. Before we get into all the complexities here, when we are working with Entity Framework Core and MVC application, we do not create tables directly in the database. Rather, we create a model in our project and we tell Entity Framework that, hey, based on the model that I have created here, I want you to figure out and create table inside database and do that automatically. Now that might seem magical right now, but it is the power of Entity Framework Core that will allow us to do all of that. Before we do anything like that in our models, we have to create a model. So in the bulky web here, we have the models folder, right click there, and we will add a new class. Now it does not have to be inside the models folder. There are no rules about that. It is one of those things that models, we typically add them in the models folder. You can rename that folder if you want, but I wanted to point out that models is not something that is required. Like we have the controllers and views folder, those names cannot be updated. They have to be exactly the same name, but models you can change it if you want. The first model that I want to work on is the category model, so I will write category.cs and press the enter button. Perfect, it creates a class here, and inside this class of category, we will be creating multiple properties. Now all the properties that we will create in the category class, they will basically be all the columns that we want in category table. How that mapping works, do not worry right now. I can write prop here and press tab. It is a code snippet. We have to press tab twice and it automatically creates a property. I will call that as ID. I have defined ID as the integer property, and this will basically be the primary key of the table. Next thing, we have another property which will be string, and let me call that name, which will be the category name. And last property that I want right now is display order. If we have multiple categories, which category should be displayed first on the page, that will define the display order. So perfect, we have created a category class here. In there we have added 3 properties. Next item that I want to focus on is I already said that ID will be the primary key of the table. But how can we explicitly define that in our model? For that we have to use something called as data annotation. Let me walk you through them in the next video. Now I have said before that ID in the category table will be the primary key. But how do we define, or rather say that this ID must be the primary key? Because sometimes, let's say if the name is category __ and then we have the ID. If the variable name is something like this, then how can Entity Framework Core know that this particular property that you have will be the primary key of the table? For that we have something called as data annotation. So right here in square bracket, if I write key, you can see it is inside system.componentModel.dataAnnotation. When I press enter here, key data annotation is added here, and that way Entity Framework Core will know that this property will be the primary key for the category table. So that sounds good. But by default, if the name is purely ID, it will automatically, or rather Entity Framework Core will automatically think that this is the primary key, and because of that the key data annotation will not be required. Also, if the name is exactly same like the model that we have, which is category followed by an ID like this, then also it will automatically treat that particular property as the primary key. But with all of that defined, if you explicitly define the key data annotation, that way looking at the key data annotation you can tell that ID is the primary key for category table. Along with that we also have another data annotation which is required. Once you add required to any of the property here, when SQL script will be generated to create this particular table in database, you will see that string will have a not null setting. That is why we have the required data annotation. Now there are more data annotations, but we will uncover them as we proceed with the course. Right now we have talked so much about creating database, creating models, having tables and adding multiple columns in there. How do we define a primary key in that table? But how do we actually create the table? For that we have to define connection string in our project to the SQL Server, and we have to configure our application to use Entity Framework Core and SQL Server. That configuration is a little bit lengthy, so stick with me and we will continue on that from the next video. We have the connection string in appsettings.json file. What we want to do next is basically create database in SQL Server. But the database that we want to create using code that we have in the application using Entity Framework Core. Entity Framework Core is the framework that will let us do all the things related to database directly from the code right here. Now back in the old days of .NET 2.2, Entity Framework Core was already included in the main package of .NET application. But as the .NET framework has enhanced, the basic application comes with the packages that are needed, and everything else have to be added manually to the project. In order to add a NuGet package to our project, we will go to Bulky Web here, right click, and we will select Manage NuGet Packages. The first package that we need is Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. It is already supported based on IntelliSense, but if not, you can search that as well. Now the version that you see here is 7.0.3, but we are using the .NET 8 in preview, so we have to enable this checkbox include pre-release. If .NET 8 was released, then if you do not have this checkbox on, you will see the latest version. We want the preview version, so select that, and we will select Microsoft.Entity Framework Core NuGet package. Let me install that package here, accept the license, and perfect, that looks good. We will be using Entity Framework Core, but for the database we will be using SQL Server, so that is also displayed right here. We need the package Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. We have the version here. Let me install that. One thing that I will always remind you is if you install one preview version or even with any .NET version, make sure all the Microsoft packages are of the same version. Like if you install Entity Framework Core with .NET 8 and then if you install other package with 7, things will not work. So make sure that every package that you install is of the same release. Let's say in middle of the course if Preview 2 or Preview 9 of .NET 8 is released, when you are installing here, you can always install the version that you want and you do not always have to install the latest one. So make sure to remember that. But after the two packages that we installed, we also have to install Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.Tools. This package will enable the commands that we will use for migration. Now what is migration? Do not panic. When the time is right, I will explain everything to you. But right now, make sure to install Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.Tools to the project. And perfect. Now we have installed 3 packages. If you go to the Installed tab here, you can see all of the packages. Again, if let's say new version is released, you can go to Update here and update all of the packages rather than updating a single package. But right now, everything looks good. Now because we add these packages inside the Manage NuGet package, they are also added in the project file. So if I click Edit here, you can see in the package reference, it has added all 3 packages right here. This is the actual location that is very important. Anytime you add a NuGet package, an entry will be added inside the project file of that project. And that way project knows which are all the packages that are being used and it will load all of them. With that, we have added the NuGet packages. Let me continue from the next video. In this video, we want to add connection string to our project. Now when we are adding a connection string, we actually need a SQL Server. So I hope you have installed SQL Server as well as SQL Server Management Studio. With that in place, if you hit the connect icon here, it will ask you for a server name. Now I have multiple servers that are installed on my local machine. If I type localhost and connect, I'm able to connect there. Next, I have localDB /MSSQL localDB. If I press that, I am able to connect to that as well. And I also have a local server with just a dot here. When I do that, I am able to connect successfully. So I have 3 different servers on my local machine based on what server you have, and you are able to connect in the SQL Server Management Studio. You can use that in the connection string. Right here, if I expand database, you can see I have an MVC test and a Red Mango API database. We will be creating a new database. But for that, we need to define connection string inside our project. Defining that is super simple, but where do we define that? You can always hardcode that in program.cs, where we will be setting up the entity framework. But all the connection and secrets will always go inside appsettings.json. It is a basic JSON file where we have a key and we have value. So if you have to define something with connection string, you can say connection here, but when you start typing, IntelliSense will show you that there is something called as connection strings. Now you can ignore that and define your own custom key here, but connection strings is what we will use to get started. That is one of the helper methods that have been provided with the app settings. So if I double click, or you can just type it here, it will be connection strings. That will be the key name. So make sure there is no spelling mistake here and it is exactly the same. Inside the double brackets here, next we have to define a key value pair where we have to define the value. What we have defined here, that is the section name, and inside there we have the key value pairing. We can call that anything we want. I will name that default connection, and then we have to define connection string in the double quotes right here. First thing that we have to define is what is the server. If I go back to SQL Server, I am using a dot here. If it was something else, make sure to copy that and I will paste it right here. I have a dot, so that works. We will add a semicolon, and next property we have to define what will be the database name. I will call that as bulky. Let me add that and semicolon. Let me hide this here, and after this I want to define two properties. First one is trusted underscore connection is equal to true and trust server certificate to be true. If you do not define them, sometimes when you have installed the SQL Server, it requires a trust certificate. If you do not set that, then the connection will not work. So perfect. These two properties you have to define as is and make sure there is no spelling mistake. In the trusted connection there is an underscore, but when we write the trust server certificate, there is no underscore or space. So with that we have defined a connection string in our project. In the app settings we have added a block with the name of connection strings, and I told you to use that exact name. Reason, I will explain that in the upcoming videos when we see everything come together. But in that connection strings block here, we have a key with the name of default connection, and there we have defined the connection string for our local SQL Server. So perfect. We have defined our connection string in appsettings.json file. Now how will we use the connection string to connect to the database and actually create a table? Let me continue for that in the next video. We have added the NuGet packages that are needed. Now we will be adding something to establish the connection between our database and entity framework. We will create a new file, but in the main project we will right-click, add a new folder with the name of data, and inside there I will create a class which will be application dbcontext.cs. Now you can call that anything you want. I am calling that application dbcontext because that is what I have been using. But before we write any code in this particular class file, make sure you remember one thing. Whatever we will do next is basic configuration that is needed for entity framework. So think about it like that. If you have to set up some other package in an application in any programming language, there are some things that you have to do. It is the basic syntax or basic classes that has to be configured in this way in order to use Entity Framework Core. And it just has to be like that. I will try to explain everything that I do here, but remember, whatever we will be programming in the next two videos is basic configuration for Entity Framework. First thing that we have to do is any class that you have here that must implement the dbContext class. That dbContext class is basically the root class of Entity Framework Core, using which we will be accessing Entity Framework. If you press Ctrl dot here, you can see we have using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. Perfect. So our application DB context now basically implements or inherits from the DB context class, which is a built-in class inside the Entity Framework Core NuGet package. Next thing that we have to do is in the DB context class in the constructor, we have to pass the connection string. Now how will we pass the connection string that we have inside appsettings.json to our DB context? Well, basically what we will do is when we will inject this application DB context, or rather configure the application DB context, we will get that connection string as a parameter in constructor as DB context option. And that we will be passing on to the base class. So right here, let me add a constructor by typing ctor, which is a snippet. And if I press tab twice, we have the constructor. Here we will be configuring something called as DB context options. And that will be on the class, which is application DB context. I will call that as options. Now again, this is something that we will be configuring. It has not been configured, and do not panic on what it will be or how I will configure that. Just remember that when we register application DB context, we will be adding some configuration. Whatever configuration that we add here, we want to pass that to the DB context class. So if we have to pass that in C#, we will write base here and we will pass the options like that. That way what will happen is whatever options we configure here will be passed on to the base class of DB context. That is great. But now where will we register this application DB context? Whenever we have to register something, we will do that in program.cs. Always remember that. So right here you can see we are adding services to the container. In that block, before we have this line of builder.build, we will be adding all the services that we want. And what we want to add is we want to tell our application that, hey, we want to use Entity Framework Core. So for that, we will be adding builder.services, and there we have to add the DB context. This is the DB context that is there in Entity Framework Core. So when we say that we want to add DB context, we are basically telling that, hey, we want to add Entity Framework Core to the project. So where we have the add DB context here, we have to tell that which class has the implementation of DB context. We added that inside the application DB context right here. So I can copy this name, go back here and paste it there. If we add a semicolon there, perfect. We have added DB context to our container. But there is one thing that is missing here. We also want to configure some option. If we go back here in C# or in .NET Core, when we have to configure options, we can call it anything we want. We can say O goes to and configure that O object, or to be explicit, I can say options goes to, which is the arrow syntax, and then we want to define what are the options we want to configure. So we will write options here, and you can see there are quite a few things that we can configure on this options object. What we want to configure is we want to tell that DB context will be using SQL Server. For that, if you write use SQL Server, it is inside Microsoft.Entity Framework Core NuGet package. That way we are telling that the DB context that we have in our project will be using SQL Server. And again, these are the basic steps that are needed to configure DB context and Entity Framework Core. Now the one last thing that is missing here is when we are using SQL Server, we have to define the connection string right here. Now where is that connection string? If you said appsettings.json file, you are correct. But how will we retrieve this connection string from app settings and pass it in the parameter right here? Let me break this in different line. And perfect. Now right now we are using a section with the name of connection strings, which is a built-in section. And there you can see it says get connection strings with the iConfiguration.getConnectionString extension method. So if I go back here, builder.configuration, and there we have a built-in helper method which is getConnectionString. You can see it is a shorthand for getting a section with the name of connection strings. That is the exact name that we have inside the appsettings.json file, and because of that it will retrieve that connection string. But inside that section we have the key value pair. Key name is default connection, so we will copy that and I will paste that right here. I will add the closing bracket here and perfect. That way it will retrieve the connection string and pass it inside the use SQL server. Before we take a look at this and see how everything comes together, let me introduce an error here by saying default connection 1. In app settings, right here we have default connection, but I have intentionally added an incorrect key name right here. With that configured, let me continue from the next video. Now that we have application DB context that is being configured in our project, how do we actually create a database? And I have said before, all the setup that is needed for Entity Framework code is complete. So basically it was not that much. If you see, we had to add couple of lines in program.cs, and we basically had to create a class file that will implement the default DB context that comes in Entity Framework core. That is all that we have to do, and Entity Framework core is configured and ready to be consumed. But how will we use that? First thing that we will do is we will actually create a database based on the connection string. I want to create a database of name bulky. Let me switch back to SQL Server here and connect to my server, which is a dot here, and examine the database. We do not have it right here. Let me go back to Visual Studio and we will go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager. We have Package Manager console. Right here we have to write few commands to work with Entity Framework core, and because of that, if you remember, we installed a NuGet package as well. Now when we change something, like if we add a model and if we want to create a table of that model, we have to do something called as add migration. But right now we do not want to do anything. We want to create the simple database that we have. And for that, all we have to do is write the command update database and press enter. When we press enter, you will notice we run into an error message. And perfect, it says the connection string property has not been initialized. And that is correct, because in program.cs we have default connection 1. It should be default connection. That is what we have in appsettings.json. So with that configured, if I open Package Manager console and run that same command once again, it will display another error message. And perfect, this time it says keyword not supported, which is server. I have introduced an error message in connection string as well. That way, if something does not work, you know that either it is not able to read the connection or something in connection string is not valid. Rather than colon here, this will be equal to. If you save that, and then if you run it once again, now it will create the database successfully. Perfect, you can see done here, and it says something that no migrations were applied database is already up to date. What does it mean by that? Do not worry. Let me go back to SQL Server and refresh the database. We have a new database with the name of Bulky, and inside tables we will have one table. That table is dbo.ef migrations history. Now what is migrations history? What is migration? Do not worry right now. For this video, I want you to remember what we did. Based on the connection string that we have, we used the command update database to create a database. That is all that we did right now. Now the next task that we want to do is, if you examine Solution Explorer, we have the category model. I want to create a table for category, and that table will have these three columns. Let me show you how to do that in the next video. Now is the time to see some magic. Well, it is not magic, it is basically the power of Entity Framework Core that we will see in this video. We want to create a category table and we want to add these three columns. Before I do that, rather than ID here, let me call that category 21ID and remove the key data annotation that we added, because I want to show you an error message before we continue on with the video. Now I have said before, if you use key data annotation, that is how Entity Framework Core will know that this column will be the primary key of the table. But right now it is not defined, and the column name, if it was category ID, which is basically the model name followed by ID, or if it was only ID, then also it will automatically default that to be the primary key. But intentionally I am calling that category 21ID. With that configured, we want to create this table in our database. Now where is our database? If we have to find that in our files, where do you think it is? Anything that we have to do with our database is inside application DB context, because that is where we have DB context, which uses Entity Framework Core. When we have to create a table here, we have to create something called as DB set inside application DB context. So I will write prop here, press tab, and the type here will be DB set, and there we have to define the entity, which is a class. So what is the entity of this DB set? We want to create a category table, so I will add category here, and then my property will basically be the table name that you want for that table. Inside SQL Server, if you want to call that categories, then you can write categories here, and that will be the table that will be created in database. This simple one line will automatically create table, and that is the power of Entity Framework Core. In order to create table, we have to do something called as a migration. To add that, we have to go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Package Manager Console. Here we will have to write a new command, which is add migration, and then we have to give our migration a meaningful name. In this migration, we know what we are doing is we are adding category table. We will give our migration the name of add category table to DB, and we will press enter. Now when you press enter, right now you will see an error message because we do not have a primary key. And perfect. You can see if we expand this here, the entity type category requires a primary key to be defined. We do not have that defined here. Because of that, we saw that error message. If I write key here and then run the migration, it will create a command to create table with this particular primary key. I do not want that. I want to call it an ID. So I will change that to be an ID, and then we will run that same command once again, which is add migration. Perfect. This time something just happened. We can see build started, build succeeded, and we have to undo this action, use remove migration. But what exactly just happened? And in the backend here, a new file has been created. If we go to Solution Explorer here, let me pin this for a second here and show you what happened. If you examine, there is a new folder that has automatically been created with the name of migrations. And there we have some random entity here, which is basically date timestamp, and then name of the migration, which is add category table to DB. That is the file that is open right here. Now what exactly is this file? Well, if you examine here, Entity Framework Core has written some code in its own language to create our category table. You can see there is something called as migration builder, and on there is a command create table. It is creating a table with the name of categories, and then in columns it is creating 3 columns: ID, name, and display order. In the constraints here we have something like table primary key will be the ID column that you can see right here. And another thing is we have something called as up and we have something called as down. So if everything is successful, we want to create this table, but if something does not go right, in the down method here it says drop the table that you were trying to create. So down is basically rolling back whatever we were doing inside the up function right here. Now again, you might be thinking that okay, we have something with migration builder, but how will this table be created? We do not have a SQL statement of create table, and we do not have anything to define the identity column. There is just something called as SQL Server.identity. That is where Entity Framework Core again comes to picture. Now that we have added the migration here, in the Package Manager console, if we run the command update database, what Entity Framework Core will do is it will check, hey, are there any migrations that have not been applied to the database? The answer will be yes, the new migration that we added has not been applied to the database yet, because if we go back to the database, we do not have that table. Now, even though this is related more on the Entity Framework side, I want to spend a couple of minutes to explain how it will figure out which migrations have not been applied. If you see in the table, it created EF migrations history table. If I do select top 1000 here, I did the edit by mistake, but if I do select top 1000, that is empty. It means no migrations have been applied on the database. Because of that, when we apply the command update database here, it will check in that database that what was the last migration that was applied. Since nothing was applied, it will go to the migrations folder, and whatever migrations are there, it will apply that on the database. So it will take this code here, convert that to the equivalent SQL code, and it will create that table. Let me see that in action. So we go back and we will press enter here, and it does something perfect. We have done here. Once it is done, if I go back to the server and if I refresh here, now you can see in the EF migrations history, it is tracking that this particular migration add category table to DB has been applied. If I refresh the table here, you will see the new table of categories has been created, and there are the 3 columns. Table name is categories, and that is what we have as the dbset property name. Right now, if you are confused and if you think that some magic just happened and it created the table, do not worry. You are just getting started with Entity Framework Core, and it is the power of Entity Framework Core that you can accomplish using migrations. As we proceed with the course, you will see this in much more detail, and you will fall in love with migrations. That way you do not have to deal with writing the SQL commands or working directly with the database. you will be doing one thing that you love, which is writing code, and that code will automatically do all the heavy lifting for your database. But before I end the video, let me summarize what we have to do when we have to create a table. We first have to create a model. Inside there we will have few properties. Next, in the application DB context, we have to create a DB set for that. Then in the package manager console, we have to add a migration. Once we add migration, then we have to run the command update database, and that will push the migrations to your database. And with that, we have created our categories table in our database. Let me continue from the next video. We want to perform CRUD operations on category. That basically means we want to create a category, get all categories, delete a category, and update a category. And for that we will be requiring a controller, because right now when we run the application, we only have the home controller. You can see we have the home and privacy here. Similarly, we want a category controller where we can manage all the categories. So let me stop the application here, and where we have home controller, in the controllers folder, right click, add, we have a controller. Now you can use the other templates that are there, but we want to start fresh, so I will use MVC, empty controller, and we have to give it a name. Let me call that category controller. Now remember, when you add a controller, you must have the controller keyword at the end. That is how the code will know that this particular class file is a controller. Let me hit the add button here, and perfect, it adds a controller. Inside there it has one action method, which is index action method. Now how will this endpoint be triggered? Let me add a debugging point here, and let me run the application. In the application, if we want to go to category controller, how will we access that? For that, we will write category here, and next, what is the action method? And next, what is the action method? The default action method that got added, it is index. So we can say index here and press enter. Perfect. It hits our debugging point here, and if we continue, we will see an error message. An unhandled exception occurred while processing the request. The view index was not found. Because here you see when the action method is called, it returns back a view. Typically, when we were working with home controller, we had views in the home folder. But when we are working with category controller, we added that controller, but we have not added any view. If you go back, it also displays which were all the locations that were searched. It will first look for a category folder and try to find index.html. If it does not find that, it will also look into shared folder, which is a shared location for all the partial views. What we have to do is we have to create a folder with the name of category and add the view inside that folder. Let me do that. We will close it here. In views, we will create a folder. It must match the name of category, and inside there we will be adding a view. Now when you are working in the view, if you right click and go to the add button, it automatically displays that, hey, default thing that users typically add is a view. So that is what it displays at the top there. Let me select that, and we will be adding the empty view. Now you can select the razor view here or the empty view. We will go with the empty view. Name index.cshtml. That looks good. Let me add that. We do not care about anything here. Let me remove that, and I will just add an h1 here, and I will say category list right here. With that, let me run the application once again. Perfect. Let me navigate to category controller. We have the index action. We will press continue and perfect. It takes us back to the view and it displays the category list that we added. So great. We have added our first controller in the application and we have also added the corresponding view, and on this page we will be displaying all the categories that we have in our database. We want to display all the categories on category list page that we added. But every time when we run the application, we do not want to go here and type this in the URL. Rather, I want to add something like category here. When we click there, it will take us to this URL. Now, where do we have this header that you see on the screen? If you said _layout, you are correct. Let me stop the application. If we go to the shared folder, we have _layout there, and there we have UL and li elements, where we have the li with the anchor tag. Now this anchor tag might seem a little different, because in this anchor tag we have something called as ASP areas. You can just delete that for now, we don't care about them. But we have something called as ASP controller and ASP action. These are tag helpers and they are useful when you are working with the .NET application. You can think of them as helper function or helper entities that are available to you. When we have the anchor tag, rather than having an href here and saying that okay, take me to /home and then index, we have the helper tags here where we can say on the anchor tag, take me to the controller, which is home controller, and in there, take me to index action. And if you look at that, it is more explicit that which controller, what action is being invoked when we click on this anchor tag. Let me copy this and paste it one more time. Next thing that we want to go is category controller and action is index action. What we want to call here is category, and perfect, that looks good. These are just the bootstrap classes, so we will ignore them, but basically we added another element right here. With that configured, let me run the application and see if that works. Perfect, we have category, and when we click there, it will hit our debugging point. Let me remove and continue. And perfect. In order to remove, you just have to click that once again and it will remove that debugging point. So perfect. Now we can go to category and navigate between pages pretty easily. On the category list page, we want to display all the categories. But if you go to database, we do not have any categories right now. Now if you want, you can do edit top 200 and basically add some categories right here. But rather than that, Entity Framework Core provides you with some helper functionality on if you have to seed some entities in your database. For that, we will have to go to Application DB Context. Let me open that. Inside the application DB context, after we have the DB set, we will override the default function which is on model creating, and that expects a model builder. Now this is a default function that is already there in DB context, and we want to override the default behavior, so we have to use the override keyword for that. It expects a model builder, and if you examine any of the migration, we were using something called as migration builder there. And here we are getting a parameter of type model builder. Using this model builder, we can seed data. Now again, do not think about why exactly we have model builder or why on model creating. It is the default thing that Entity Framework has implemented, and we are just using that to seed data. And in order to see data, we will be using model builder. There we have entity and what entity we want to create or work on. That is the category right here. So we will say category and then what we want to do. We want to add some data. So on there we have a method which has data, and inside there you can see in the params here, it expects a category array. And if you examine the comments here, it says adds seed data to this entity type. We want to create a new object here. So in has data, we will say new category. And there we will have to populate ID. We will give that one name. Let me call that action. And display order is 1. Using that, it will create this particular entity. But if you want to create more categories, you can add a comma and paste it multiple times here. Let's say you want action, then you have sci-fi, and you have history. We will change the display order as well, and we will keep them the same as ID. Perfect. Now we are telling Entity Framework Core that hey, on category we want to create these 3 records. And again, to do that, we will have to add migration. Whenever anything has to be updated with database, we have to add a migration. Always, always, always remember that. So we will say add migration, and I will call this seed category table. Perfect, that works. If you examine the migration, it is calling something called as insert data, and it is inserting 3 records. All of them looks perfect. So what do we do to apply these changes? We run the command update database, and that will seed our data. Perfect. With that, if I go back here and refresh, great. We have 3 records in our category table. In the next video, let me show you how we can easily retrieve the 3 records that we have in our categories table. Now that we have 3 records in the categories table, how can we retrieve and display them in the index view for our category? In order to pass that to the view, we have to retrieve that in our controller, because whatever we pass to the view here, that is what it will use and display in the UI. So first we have to work on the controller here. For that, let me close everything else here, and when we have to work like retrieve data, add data or update data, we will be working with one thing, that is application DB context. Now if this was not a .NET Core application, what we used to do is we will have an application DB context here. We will create a new object of that. Let me call that something like DB here. And then on that DB, we will have to open connection, close connection, and all of that. But we are not working with legacy .NET application. We are working with .NET Core. What happens with .NET Core is when you add something to the services container right here, that way you are adding that to dependency injection. Right here you have told the .NET application that hey, whenever someone asks an implementation of application DB context, this is the configuration that you have to do, and based on that you have to create an object and provide that. Because of that, we no longer have to work with creating those objects. What we can do here is we can directly tell the application that hey, give me an implementation of application DB context. I know you have that because I registered that inside the services. We will get that inside constructor. So I will write CTOR and press tab here, and inside the parameter here, we can tell that what object or what implementation we want. We want an implementation of application DB context. Let me call that as DB. Then right here, let me create a private read-only field, which is application DB context. Call that underscore DB. And whatever implementation we get inside the constructor here, we will assign that to our local variable. That way we will be able to use this inside any other action method. Next, what we want to do is in the index here, we want to retrieve all the categories. You do not have to write any SQL for that. Using Entity Framework Core, you can retrieve all of that. So here, let me call this as var, and I will call that obj category list is equal to, we will use underscore db. IntelliSense here is displaying the complete command that is needed, but let me type that. On this underscore db, we can access all of the db sets that we added. The db set that we want to retrieve this time is categories. So if we type categories, we retrieve that, and on there we have a method .toList that will convert that to a list and assign it right here. Because of that, we can also call this as list of category. I personally do not like using var, so you can be explicit that a list of categories will be retrieved using this command. You can see how simple it is with Entity Framework Core. You have to write only 3 words here. It will